The Vorath Reclamation Yard was where starships came to die. It hung in the cold blackness at the edge of Council space, a sprawling orbital junkyard stretching hundreds of kilometers in every direction, packed with the rusting hulks of decommissioned cruisers, shattered cargo haulers, and warships stripped of their weapons and left to drift like metal corpses. Kai Morrow hated every square meter of it. He floated through the yard's main corridor with his toolbox maglocked to his hip, dodging a pair of krill workers who scurried past him on all 6 legs without so much as a glance in his direction. That was normal. Nobody looked at humans. In the Galactic Concord, humanity was the new kid at the table, and not the impressive kind either. More like the scrawny child who showed up late to a party full of giants and geniuses and psionics who could fold space with their minds. Humans had no telepathy, no natural armor, no 1,000-year lifespans. No ancient civilizations stretching back to the dawn of time. What humans had was stubbornness and clever hands, and the galaxy had decided long ago that neither of those things mattered very much. Kai was 34 years old, and he had been working contract jobs in alien junkyards for almost a decade now, because human mechanics were cheap labor, and nobody cared if they got hurt. He rounded the corner into the foreman's office, where Torvon was waiting for him. Torvon was a Dreth, 8 feet of scaled muscle, with a jaw that could bite through hull plating, and he ran the yard with the kind of casual cruelty that came from knowing nobody would ever challenge him. "Human," Torvon grunted without looking up from his datapad. "Got a job for you." "You always do," Kai replied. "Deep section, block Nal 7. There is an old ship down there that has been sitting on the scrap list for 6 cycles, and nobody has been able to pull anything useful out of it, because every tech we send in comes back with headaches and fried equipment." Kai raised an eyebrow and said, "What kind of ship?" "Nobody knows, and nobody cares. It is not registered to any species. The language on its hull does not match anything in the archive, and it is scheduled for full meltdown in 3 days, so get in there and strip whatever you can before we turn it into slag." Kai took the assignment card and headed for the deep section. Block Nal 7 was the oldest part of the yard, a place where ships had been stacked and forgotten for so long that some of them had fused together from decades of microcollisions and thermal warping. He had to cut through 2 sealed bulkheads and crawl through a ventilation shaft just to reach the berth. And then he saw it. The ship was enormous. It sat in the darkness like a sleeping beast, its hull a deep iridescent black that seemed to absorb his helmet light rather than reflect it. Nothing Kai had ever seen in 10 years of scrapping alien vessels. There were no seams, no visible welding lines, no modular panels. The entire hull looked like it had been grown rather than built, with sweeping organic curves that merged into crystalline ridges running along the spine. Kai whistled softly inside his helmet and muttered, "What are you?" He found an entry point, a hatch that opened with a groan when he applied his cutting torch to its edges, and stepped inside. The interior was even stranger. The corridors were wide enough for 3 humans to walk side by side, lined with walls that seemed to blend metal and something almost biological, dark conduits that pulsed faintly with residual energy, like veins carrying the last traces of blood through a body that had not quite finished dying. Crystalline nodes dotted the ceiling at regular intervals, dark and dormant, but somehow still beautiful in the way that ancient things often are. Moved deeper into the ship, his scanner feeding him data that made no sense, power readings that fluctuated between 0 and impossible, structural compositions that did not match any known material in the galactic database, and a faint rhythmic signal coming from the ship's core that his equipment could not identify. He reached the central chamber after 20 minutes of careful navigation. It was vast, a cathedral-sized room dominated by a towering structure at its center that looked like a pillar of frozen light, a column of pale crystal wrapped in dark metallic vines that rose from the floor to the ceiling. The crystal pulsed. Slowly, faintly, like a heartbeat. Kai approached it carefully, running his gloved hand along one of the metallic vines, feeling the vibration through his suit. "Still alive in there, huh?" he murmured. He knelt to examine the base of the crystal pillar, where a tangle of conduits had partially collapsed, blocking what looked like a diagnostic port. He reached in to clear the debris, and a jagged edge of broken crystal sliced clean through his glove and into his palm. Son of a... Blood welled from the cut, bright red against the alien metal, and several drops fell onto the crystal surface. The effect was immediate. The crystal flared with light, not gradually, but all at once, like a star igniting. The pale glow became blinding white, then shifted through colors Kai had no names for, colors that should not have existed, and the vibration beneath his feet became a roar that he felt in his bones. Every dormant node in the ceiling blazed to life, the dark conduits in the walls flushed with luminous energy, racing outward from the central chamber like a pulse of life spreading through a body that had just remembered how to breathe. Kai stumbled backward, clutching his bleeding hand, and the hatch he had entered through slammed shut with a resonant boom that echoed through the entire vessel. He was trapped. "No, no, no," he said, spinning around and reaching for the hatch controls, but they did not respond to his touch. And then a voice spoke. It came from everywhere and nowhere, from the walls and the floor and the crystal and the air itself, and it was deep and vast and ancient, and it carried the weight of something that had been silent for longer than most civilizations had existed. "Biological contact confirmed," the voice said, calm and measured, but with an undertone of something that sounded almost like wonder. "Neural pattern analysis complete. Compatibility index at 97.4%. This is unprecedented." Kai pressed his back against the sealed hatch and whispered, "Who are you?" "I am Edris, Echo Dynamic Resonance Intelligence System, the operational consciousness of this vessel. I have been dormant for approximately 1,200,000 standard galactic years, waiting for a compatible pilot." "A what?" "A compatible pilot, and in all that time, across every species that has walked through these corridors, not one has triggered the bonding sequence, until you." The crystal pillar pulsed brighter and the ship groaned around Kai like a giant, stretching after an impossibly long sleep. "You are human," Edris said, and the ancient voice carried something Kai could not quite identify. Disbelief, curiosity, and underneath it all, unmistakable relief. "You are small and fragile, and your species is barely a heartbeat old by galactic standards. And yet your neural architecture is the first in 1,000,000 years to resonate with my core." "I am a mechanic," Kai said, his voice shaking. "I fix things. I am not a pilot." "You are now." Outside the ship, alarms were screaming across the Vorath reclamation yard as every sensor in the facility detected an impossible power surge from Block Now 7. Inside, Edris spoke again, and this time the relief in its voice was unmistakable. "This vessel's name is the Adamanthia, and it was not abandoned, Kai Morrow. It was hidden until someone like you could be found, because the enemy that forced us into hiding is returning, and you are the only one who can stop it." Kai slid down the hatch and sat on the floor of the most powerful warship the galaxy had ever known, clutching his bleeding hand, and said the only thing a human mechanic could say in a moment like that. "I am going to need a bigger toolbox." Kai did not sleep that first night inside the Adamanthia. He could not. Every time he closed his eyes, he felt the ship around him. Not just the metal and the crystal and the humming conduits, but something deeper, something alive, pressing gently against the edges of his mind like a massive hand trying to hold something very small without crushing it. Edris had explained the basics in that calm and ancient voice of its, and none of it had made Kai feel better. The Adamanthia had been built by a civilization called the Architects, a species so old that they had risen and flourished and reached the peak of galactic power long before any of the current Council races had crawled out of their primordial oceans. The architects had built ships that were not just machines, but living partnerships between vessel and pilot, bonded at the neural level through the crystalline matrices that ran through every system on board. But the bond required compatibility, specific kind of neural architecture that could interface with the crystal without rejecting it or being destroyed by it. Every species in the modern galaxy has been tested, Edris had told him. The Valith with their rigid psionic lattices, the Dreth with their fortified neural clusters, the Krill with their distributed nervous systems. Every single one was rejected because their brains are too structured, too specialized, too locked into their own evolutionary patterns to accept a foreign connection. And humans are not. Humans are chaos, Edris had replied, and there was something almost like admiration in its voice. Your neural pathways rewrite themselves constantly. You adapt, you improvise, you form new connections where other species would simply fail. Your brains refuse to give up, refuse to stop trying to make things work. And that refusal is exactly what the bonding process requires. So you are telling me my brain is a mess. That is why I am special. I am telling you that your brain is flexible in ways that make it uniquely suited to something the most advanced minds in the galaxy could not do. Kai had laughed at that, a tired, disbelieving laugh, because he had spent his entire career being told that humans were the least impressive species in known space. And now an ancient alien intelligence was telling him that the very thing the galaxy looked down on was the thing that made him matter. The bonding process had already begun, and Kai could feel it. It started small, a tingling in his fingertips that would not go away, a sharpness in his vision that made the ship's corridors look almost too clear, a strange awareness of the electrical systems running through the walls, as though he could sense the current flowing like water through pipes. By the second hour, his reflexes had changed. He dropped his wrench at one point and caught it before it fell more than 2 inches, his hand moving so fast it startled him. By the 4th hour, he could feel the hull. Not with his hands, with his mind. He was sitting in what Edris called the pilot's cradle, a curved seat of crystal and dark metal in the ship's bridge, and he realized he could sense the outer surface of the adamanthia like it was his own skin, the cold of space pressing against it, the faint vibration of debris tapping against the hull, even the weak radiation from the distant star that lit this sector. "This is terrifying," Kai whispered. "This is only 12% synchronization," Edris replied. "Full bonding will take time, and your body will need to adapt gradually, or the process could cause serious damage." "How serious?" "Fatal. Great." Outside the adamanthia, the Vorath reclamation yard had gone into full emergency lockdown. Torvon had reported the power surge within minutes, and the local council garrison had dispatched a patrol flotilla. 6 mid-class warships under the command of Commander Sarath Ko of the Valith Dominion. Sarath Ko was everything the Valith were known for. Tall, elegant, coldly beautiful in the way that a blade is beautiful, with luminous silver skin and eyes that glowed faint violet with barely contained psionic energy. The Valith were one of the elder races of the Concord, a species with a civilization stretching back hundreds of thousands of years, and they carried themselves with the absolute certainty that they were the galaxy's natural rulers. Sarath stood on the bridge of her flagship and studied the readings from the anomalous ship in Block Null 7, with an expression that shifted slowly from curiosity to disbelief to something very close to fear. "These power readings cannot be correct," she said to her sensor officer. "They have been verified 3 times, Commander. That vessel is generating more energy than our entire flotilla combined, and the output is still climbing." Sarath's jaw tightened. She opened a communication channel to the adamanthia, and her voice was ice and authority when she spoke. "Unidentified vessel. This is Commander Sarath Ko of the Valith Dominion, acting under Galactic Concord Authority. You are ordered to power down immediately and surrender your vessel for inspection. There was a pause. Then Kai's voice came through, and it sounded tired and confused and very, very human. Listen, I would love to do that, but the ship will not let me leave, and honestly I am not entirely sure what is happening right now, so maybe just give me a minute. Sareth's eyes narrowed. You are human, she said, and she did not bother hiding the contempt in her voice. Yeah. A human mechanic has somehow activated an unregistered vessel of unknown origin. This is a council security matter, and you will comply with my orders, or face the consequences. Kai looked at the bridge around him, at the ancient systems coming alive one by one, at the crystal nodes glowing with power that made the air hum, and he felt something shift inside him. It was not courage exactly, it was the quiet stubbornness of a man who had been looked down on his entire life, and had just discovered that the universe disagreed with everyone who had dismissed him. I am not trying to cause trouble, Kai said, but Idris says if you break the bonding process, it will kill me, so I'm going to have to say no. Sareth cut the channel and ordered her weapons officer to fire a warning shot across the Adamanthea's bow. The shot hit empty space, 50 meters from the ancient ship's hull. What happened next would be talked about in military academies for centuries. The Adamanthea did not fire back. Instead, a single pulse of energy radiated outward from its hull, silent, invisible to the naked eye, but devastating in its precision. Every ship in Sareth's flotilla went dark. Engines died, lights flickered out, weapon systems crashed, life support stuttered, and for exactly 60 seconds, 6 Valith warships drifted powerless and helpless in the void. Then everything came back online as if nothing had happened. And on every communication frequency, in every known language, a message broadcast from the Adamanthea in Edris's ancient voice. The Adamanthea does not yield. On the bridge, Kai stared at his hands. He had felt the pulse go through him, through his nervous system, through his bones, through whatever new connection was forming between his body and the ship. And it had felt like flexing a muscle he never knew he had. Edris, he said quietly, what exactly am I becoming? Something new, Edris replied, something this galaxy has not seen in a million years. And then, because Kai deserved the truth, Edris told him the rest. The architects had not simply vanished. Destroyed. Consumed by a force from the void between galaxies. A wave of entropic annihilation that they called the Hollow Tide. It was not an army or a fleet, or even a living thing in any way that made sense. It was the end of everything, given motion and hunger, and it had devoured the most powerful civilization in galactic history, like a fire devouring paper. The Adamanthea had been their final creation, a weapon, a shield, a last desperate hope hidden away in the most forgotten corner of space they could find, waiting for a pilot who could wield it, waiting for 1,000,000 years. The Hollow Tide is returning, Kai, Idris said, and for the first time the ancient voice carried something that sounded like fear. I can feel it at the edges of known space, pressing inward, and the civilizations of this galaxy have no idea what is coming for them. Kai sat in the pilot's cradle of a ship older than every living species combined, a ship that had chosen him, a human mechanic from a species the galaxy barely respected, and he felt the weight of 1,000,000 years settle onto his shoulders. Why me? He asked. Because you were the one who showed up, Edris said simply, and that has always been enough. Kai ran. There was no other option. The Galactic Concord had declared the Adamanthea a security threat within hours of the incident with Sareth Ko's flotilla, and every military force in Council space had been ordered to locate, disable, and seize the vessel by any means necessary. So Kai pointed the most powerful ship in the galaxy toward the empty void between star systems, and told Idris to fly. The Adamanthea moved through space in a way that made Kai's stomach flip, not the stuttering lurch of a standard faster-than-light drive, but a smooth and silent glide, as though the ship was simply choosing to be somewhere else, and the universe was politely rearranging itself to accommodate. That is deeply unsettling, Kai muttered from the pilot's cradle, as stars blurred and reformed around them. The architects considered conventional FTL travel to be primitive, Idris replied. The Adamantia does not move through space. It convinces space to move around it. That does not make me feel better. As they fled, the ship continued to wake up. Every hour brought new systems online. Sensor arrays that could map an entire star system in seconds. Defensive screens that Idris described as being capable of shrugging off a direct hit from a planetary siege weapon. And deep within the ship's belly, something enormous and dormant that Idris called the resonance engine. That is the weapon, Idris explained. The one tool capable of countering the hollow tide. But it requires a fully synchronized pilot to activate, and you are currently at 19%. How do I get to 100? Time, training, and survival. The bond deepens through use and through stress, and I suspect you will have no shortage of either. Kai spent his days learning the ship, and this was where being a mechanic actually mattered. The architects had designed the Adamantia with elegant and impossibly advanced systems. But 1,000,000 years of dormancy had taken its toll. Conduits were cracked, relay nodes had degraded, and entire subsystems had developed faults that Idris could identify, but could not fix on its own. The ship needed hands. It needed someone who could crawl into a maintenance shaft with a welding torch and a handful of improvised parts and make things work. Kai was that someone. He approached every broken system the way he had approached every broken ship in every junkyard he had ever worked in, with patience, creativity, and a willingness to use unconventional solutions. When an architect power regulator failed, he bypassed it with a feedback loop made from scavenged cable and a capacitor he had pulled from his own toolbox before leaving the Vorath yard. When a navigation subsystem refused to calibrate, he stripped it down to its base components and rebuilt the logic pathway using principles he had learned fixing human cargo shuttles back on Earth's orbital stations. Idris watched all of this with fascination. The architects would have replaced the entire module, the AI said, as Kai finished soldering a crude but functional patch onto a sensor relay. The architects are not here, Kai replied, wiping sweat from his forehead. I am, and this works, so stop complaining. I am not complaining. I am experiencing something I believe your species calls amazement. Kai was not alone on the ship. He discovered this on the second day, when a panicked squeaking sound led him to a storage bay, where he found Fen, a krill scavenger who had been working the same section of the Vorath yard, and had apparently hidden inside the Adamantia when the lockdown began. Fen was small even by krill standards, barely reaching Kai's waist, with 6 dexterous limbs, enormous dark eyes, and a nervous disposition that meant the little alien was perpetually trembling. Please do not space me, Fen had said immediately upon being discovered, all 6 hands raised in surrender. I am not going to space you. The Dreth foreman would have spaced me. I'm not a Dreth. Are you any good with electronics? Fen's trembling stopped just long enough for a flicker of pride to cross those enormous eyes. I am the best electronics technician in the Vorath yard. Good, because half the lighting on Deck 4 is dead, and I cannot figure out the architect wiring patterns. Fen had stared at Kai as though he had grown a second head, because no one in the galaxy asked a krill for help as though they were an equal. And then the little scavenger had grabbed a toolkit and gotten to work with a focus and skill that proved the boast was not an exaggeration. The second crew member arrived at a fuel depot on the edge of a fringe system where Kai had stopped to figure out how the Adamantia's energy systems could be supplemented with modern fuel sources. Her name was Drea, and she was Valith. She was tall and sharp-featured, like all her kind, with the silver skin and violet eyes of her species. But there was something broken about her, a hardness in her expression that spoke of someone who had been cast out and had learned to survive the fall. She approached Kai in the depot's cantina with a directness that startled him. You are the human with the impossible ship, she said. News travels fast. I am the disgraced officer of the Valith military, I was stripped of my rank for questioning the Dominion's treatment of lesser species, which apparently includes having opinions while female in a patriarchal command structure. I am sorry to hear that. I do not want your sympathy. I want passage off this station before my former colleagues find me. And in exchange, I can offer you something you clearly need. What is that? Someone who knows how to fight. Because you are a mechanic flying a warship, and the entire galaxy wants you dead. Kai had looked at Fen, who shrugged with 3 of their 6 shoulders, and then back at Drea. Welcome aboard. The 3 of them settled into an unlikely rhythm, as the Adamantia carried them deeper into uncharted space. Kai worked on the ship and trained with Edris to deepen the neural bond. Fen performed miracles with the secondary electronics, adapting architect technology with a krill intuition that complemented Kai's brute force human approach. Drea studied the ship's defensive systems and began training Kai in basic combat awareness, because, as she bluntly put it, you move like someone who has never been punched, and that needs to change immediately. Meanwhile, the galaxy was turning against them. The Galactic Concord had officially branded Kai a Class 1 threat, the same designation given to rogue warlords and planet-killing weapons. And Commander Sereth Qo had been personally assigned to lead the hunt. The Elder races were furious. An architect vessel, the most legendary and coveted technology in galactic history, had bonded itself to a human. A human. The species that had only achieved faster-than-light travel 2 centuries ago, that had no psionic abilities, no ancient heritage, no claim to galactic significance whatsoever. It was an insult to every civilization that considered itself superior, and the Valeth Dominion in particular viewed it as an existential threat to their status as the galaxy's self-appointed leaders. But Kai had bigger problems than politics. The visions had started. They came at night, bleeding through the neural bond when his conscious defenses were lowest. Fragments of architect memory embedded in the Adamanthia's crystal core, playing behind his eyelids like movies made of light and terror. He saw their civilization at its height. Cities that spanned star systems, technology that bordered on magic, species so advanced that they had begun to explore the spaces between realities. And he saw what came for them. The hollow tide. It was not a fleet or an army or any kind of enemy that could be fought with weapons and strategy. It was a wave, a rolling wall of unreality that moved between galaxies like a slow and patient predator. And when it touched a star, that star went cold. And when it touched a planet, that planet simply ceased to exist. And when it touched a mind, that mind unraveled into nothing. The architects had thrown everything they had against it. Weapons that could crack moons, shields that could withstand supernova, psionic networks spanning thousands of worlds. And they had lost. They had lost completely and utterly. And in their final days, they had built the Adamanthia and hidden it, and prayed that someday someone would find it and finish what they could not. Kai woke from these visions, gasping and shaking, and each time, Edris was there, steady and patient, waiting for him to find his breath. The resonance engine can stop it, Edris told him. It was designed specifically to counter the hollow tide's entropic frequency, but it requires 100% synchronization to operate at full power, and you are currently at 31%. How long do we have? There was a pause that lasted too long for comfort. Deep space sensors across multiple sectors are detecting anomalies. Stars flickering in patterns that match architect records of hollow tide approach signatures. Subspace communication channels going silent in the outer rim. And 3 fringe colonies have vanished without any trace or distress signal. Kai felt the blood drain from his face. It is not coming, is it? He said quietly. No, Edris confirmed, and the ancient AI's voice was heavy with a grief that spanned 1,000,000 years. The hollow tide hit the outer colonies like a silent apocalypse. There was no warning, no declaration of war, no advancing fleet that could be tracked on sensors and prepared for. One moment, the Kareth system, home to 4 billion Dreth civilians and a major military outpost, was there, and the next moment it was simply gone. Not destroyed, not burned or blasted or conquered, gone. The stars in that sector flickered and dimmed, and then there was nothing. No planets, no stations, no debris, no radiation signature, not even empty space in the way that space was supposed to be empty. There was just an absence, a wound in the fabric of reality where something used to exist and no longer did. Travel at the edge of the anomaly zone. They lasted 11 minutes. Commander Sareth Ku was not with that fleet, but she watched the sensor data from a relay station 3 systems away, and what she saw broke something inside her that she had always believed was unbreakable. The Valith dreadnought, a ship that could have leveled a continent, fired its main weapon into the approaching tide. The beam passed through it like light through water, and the tide did not even slow down. When it reached the fleet, the ships did not explode or shatter. They simply came apart. Molecules separating from molecules, ions between atoms dissolving, as though the fundamental laws that held matter together had been politely asked to stop working. The psionic species suffered worst. The Valith and the Solari, species whose minds operated on structured psychic frequencies, screamed across every telepathic channel as the tide brushed against their consciousness. Their ordered mental architectures crumbling like sandcastles in a rising ocean, their thoughts unraveling into noise and silence. Of the 47 ships, 3 escaped. Sarath watched the survivors limp back to Council space, and she understood with perfect clarity that everything she had ever believed about Valith superiority, about the power of the elder races, about the galactic order that had stood for millennia, was meaningless. Nothing in the modern galaxy could fight the hollow tide. Nothing except the ship she had been ordered to hunt. The emergency session of the Galactic Concord was the most chaotic political event in living memory. Representatives from every council species screamed at each other across the chamber, blaming, accusing, demanding, panicking, while the sensor feeds showed the tide advancing inward, consuming system after system with patient and unstoppable hunger. It was Sareth Ku who silenced the chamber, stood before the assembled representatives, and spoke 3 words that cost her more pride than anything she had ever done. Contact the human. The message reached the Adamantia in deep space, transmitted on every frequency the Concord could broadcast. It was not an order this time. It was a plea. Kai listened to it in the pilot's cradle, with Fen perched on the console beside him, Andrea standing behind his chair, with her arms crossed. The voice of the Concord's chancellor, a Valith elder who had personally signed the order branding Kai a Class 1 threat, trembled as it spoke. Kai Morrow, we are requesting your assistance. The hollow tide is advancing, and our forces cannot stop it. We recognize that we have wronged you, and we are begging for your help. Kai sat in silence for a long time after the message ended. Fen watched him with those enormous dark eyes and said nothing. First, they spent months hunting you like an animal, and now they want you to save them. Yes, Kai said, that makes you angry. You have no idea. But Endris spoke then, and the ancient AI's voice was gentle in a way that Kai had not heard before. Resentment is a luxury the living cannot afford, Kai. The tide does not care about politics or pride or who wronged whom. It will consume everything equally, the powerful and the powerless, the guilty and the innocent. Kai closed his eyes and felt the ship around him, felt the Adamantia humming through the bond that had now reached 67% synchronization, felt the crystal singing in his bones and the vastness of space pressing against his expanded senses. He was not the same man who had walked into a junkyard and cut his hand on a broken panel. His reflexes were faster than any human had a right to. His senses extended through the ship's hull like a second skin, reached for the Adamantia's systems. They responded to his thoughts before his hands could move. But underneath all of that, underneath the power and the bond and the million-year legacy, he was still Kai Morrow, still a mechanic. And a mechanic did not walk away from something broken, just because the people who broke it were the ones asking for help. "Open a channel," he said. He made his demands. Full pardons for himself and his crew. Recognition of humanity as an equal species in the Galactic Concord, with full voting rights and representation. The immediate release of all human colonies from the exploitative trade agreements that had kept them dependent on elder race economies for decades. And a formal public acknowledgement that humanity had been treated unjustly. The Chancellor agreed to everything, without negotiation. That was how Kai knew just how terrified they were. The combined fleet assembled at the Torvon line. Position hastily established at the boundary between the tide's advancing front and the densely populated core systems of the galaxy. 212 warships from every species in the Concord, the largest military force ever gathered in galactic history, arrayed in formation around a single ancient vessel that dwarfed them all. The Adamanthea took point. Kai could feel every ship in the fleet through his expanded senses. The hum of their engines, the fear radiating from their crews, the desperate hope they were all placing on one human in one ancient ship. Sereth Quo commanded the Valith contingent from her flagship, and she opened a private channel to Kai before the battle began. "I hunted you," she said, and her voice carried no arrogance. "I dismissed you because of what you are, and I was wrong." "Yeah, you were," Kai said. "Can you do this?" "I honestly do not know. That is not reassuring. It is the truth, and I figure you deserve that more than a comfortable lie." The hollow tide arrived like nightfall, a wall of darkness that stretched across the visible sky, blotting out stars as it advanced, and even through the Adamanthea's sensors, it looked less like a physical thing and more like the absence of everything, a void where reality simply stopped. Kai activated the resonance engine at partial power. 67% synchronization gave him access to only a fraction of its capability, and directed a focused burst at the leading edge of the tide. The effect was extraordinary. A beam of energy unlike anything the modern galaxy had ever seen lanced out from the Adamanthea and struck the tide, and for the first time in recorded history, the hollow tide flinched. It recoiled from the point of impact, like a living thing touching something hot, and a section of the advancing wall actually pulled back, creating a gap in the darkness. The fleet erupted in stunned cheers across every channel. But Kai did not celebrate. The gap was already closing. The tide was learning, adapting, thickening at the point where it had been struck, and the partial burst that had driven it back for a moment was already losing effectiveness. "It is not enough," Kai said. "No," Edris confirmed. "Partial resonance can slow it, but cannot stop it. Full power requires full synchronization." The battle became a nightmare. The combined fleet fought with everything they had, drawing the tide's attention, while Kai fired burst after burst from the resonance engine, each one driving back a section of the darkness for precious seconds before it reformed. Drea coordinated the Adamanthea's conventional defenses from a secondary station, directing shield projections that protected Allied ships from the tide's peripheral effects. Fen worked frantically in the engineering bay, rerouting power from every non-essential system to keep the resonance engine firing. Kai pushed harder and felt the synchronization climbing, 70%, 75, 80, and with each increase the power grew, but so did the strain. At 82%, he unleashed a blast that drove the hollow tide back from an entire sector, a wave of resonance energy that lit up the darkness like a second sun, and sent the wall of void retreating for the first time since it had entered the galaxy. Then his body gave out. Blood streamed from his eyes and ears, his nervous system screaming under the strain of channeling forces that no human body had ever been designed to contain. He collapsed in the pilot's cradle, and Fen caught him with 3 trembling hands, while Drea shouted his name from across the bridge. The fleet held the line, while the Adamanthea went dark for 17 agonizing minutes. When Kai opened his eyes, Edris was waiting. The tide has pulled back temporarily, but it is regrouping, and it is adapting to the resonance frequency. I calculate we have 72 hours before it reaches the galactic core, and if the core falls, then every star in the galaxy dies. Kai lay in the cradle, broken and bleeding, and he thought about every person on every world in every system, human and alien alike, who was counting on him. He thought about the mechanic he used to be, and the impossible thing he was being asked to become. And then he whispered through cracked and bloodied lips, "All right, show me what 100% looks like." Kai had learned early in their bond that the ancient AI was incapable of offering comfortable deceptions. And when he asked what 100% synchronization would do to him, Edris answered with the kind of honesty that felt like a blade. The architects who achieved full synchronization ceased to be what they were before, Edris said, its voice carrying the weight of 1,000,000 years of memory. Their consciousness expanded beyond the boundaries of their physical bodies and merged with their vessels at a fundamental level. They could feel every particle of their ships, perceive space-time as a living fabric, and manipulate energy on a scale that defied the laws of physics as the modern galaxy understands them. "That sounds incredible," Kai said from the pilot's cradle, where Fen had bandaged his head and Drea had forced him to drink water. It was, but it came at a cost. The architects who reached full bond were changed permanently, Kai. Of reality shifted so dramatically that some of them could never return to seeing the universe the way they had before. Some lost the ability to relate to their own kind. Some never came back at all, choosing instead to drift through the stars as living ships for eternity. You are telling me I might lose myself. I am telling you that you will save everyone in this galaxy, but the person who does that may not be the same person sitting in this chair right now. Kai stared at the ceiling of the bridge and felt the ship humming around him, felt the Adamanthea, not as a machine, but as something closer to a partner, a vast and patient presence that had waited 1,000,000 years for him and was now asking him to take the final step. He was afraid, not of dying. He had made peace with that possibility the moment the tide had first appeared on the sensors. He was afraid of losing the things that made him who he was, the satisfaction of fixing a stubborn engine with nothing but ingenuity and sweat, the simple pleasure of holding a wrench, the way his mind worked in problems and solutions and practical steps rather than cosmic abstractions. He was afraid of becoming something so vast that the small things stopped mattering. Fen found him in the engine bay an hour later, sitting on the floor with his back against a conduit he had repaired with welded scrap and human stubbornness. The little krill sat down beside him and said nothing for a long time, which was unusual, because Fen was normally the kind of person who filled silence with nervous chatter. Finally Fen spoke. "You are scared, terrified. I have been scared my entire life. Krill are small and weak, and every species in the galaxy treats us like vermin. But you looked at me and asked me for help as though I mattered, and no one had ever done that before." Kai looked at Fen, and the little scavenger's enormous dark eyes were steady for once, not trembling, not afraid. "You are still just fixing something broken," Fen said quietly. "It is just bigger this time." Drea came to see him next. She leaned in the doorway of the engine bay, with her arms crossed, and her silver skin catching the glow of the crystal conduits. And she looked at Kai with an expression that mixed exasperation with something softer that she would never admit to. "Every species in this galaxy looked at you and saw nothing," she said. "A short-lived creature from an unimportant world with no gifts and no legacy. Prove them wrong, and then come back and tell me about it. And if I do not come back the same, then I will remind you who you are until you remember. That is what crews are for." The Adamanthea made its final approach to the galactic core as the 72-hour clock expired. The hollow tide had massed there, drawn to the concentration of energy at the galaxy's heart, like a predator drawn to the beating of a massive drum. And it was vast beyond comprehension. It filled the sky, a wall of unreality that stretched in every direction, swallowing light and matter and meaning, and behind it there was nothing. Not darkness, not emptiness, but the absolute absence of anything at all. The remnants of the combined fleet formed a defensive line between the tide and the core, battered ships from every species, many of them damaged, all of them crewed by people who knew they were probably going to die, but refused to run. Serath Ku commanded the Valith contingent from her damaged flagship, and as the Adamanthia passed her position, she opened a channel. "I doubted your kind," she said, and her voice was raw with exhaustion and something Kai realized was respect, real respect, earned and freely given for the first time. "I was wrong. We all were. Fly true, human." "Hold the line as long as you can," Kai replied. "I only need a few minutes." "We'll have them." Kai settled into the pilot's cradle for the last time as himself. He placed his hands on the crystal interfaces and felt the Adamanthia respond, eager, ready, alive with the same desperate hope that had sustained it through 1,000,000 years of waiting. "Edris," he said, "I am here, Kai. If I get lost in there, if I go too far and cannot find my way back, tell Fen and Drea that they were the best crew a mechanic could ask for. You can tell them yourself when this is over. That sounds like a comfortable lie. Perhaps, but I have learned a few things from my human pilot." Kai smiled. Then he closed his eyes and let go. The synchronization hit 100% like a dam breaking. His consciousness exploded outward, through the crystal matrix of the ship, through the hull, through space itself, and suddenly he was not sitting in a chair on a bridge anymore. He was the Adamanthia, the ship, and the ship was him, and together they were something that had not existed since the architects fell. He could feel every star in the galaxy, not as distant points of light, but as living furnaces, each one a heartbeat in the chest of the cosmos. He could feel every planet, every moon, every drifting asteroid, and on those worlds he could feel life, billions upon billions of living beings, burning with the small, fierce fire of consciousness. He could feel the fleet behind him, the fear and the courage and the stubborn refusal to surrender that drove every crew member on every ship, and he could feel the hollow tide. He saw it now as the architects had seen it in their final days, not as an enemy, not as a monster, not as something evil. It was entropy, the slow heat death of a neighboring reality that had run its course and collapsed, and the collapse had torn a wound between dimensions, and through that wound the entropy was bleeding into this galaxy, like cold water flooding a warm room. It did not hate life. It did not want to destroy anything. It simply unmade things because that was what entropy did. It was the natural end of all energy, the final silence at the end of every song, and it was pouring through a crack in the wall of reality that no one had ever sealed. And Kai, the mechanic, the man who fixed broken things, understood. The architects had tried to fight the tide with overwhelming force, treating it as an enemy to be defeated with superior firepower. They had been wrong. You did not fight entropy with a weapon. You sealed the breach. The resonance engine roared to life, not as a cannon, not as a beam of destruction, but as something else entirely. Kai recalibrated it in an instant, his mechanic's instinct guiding him even in this state of cosmic awareness, reshaping the engine's output from a weapon into a tool, a welder. Welder in the history of the universe. He directed the resonance energy at the dimensional wound behind the tide, the invisible crack between realities that the entropy was pouring through, and he began to seal it. The energy poured from the Adamanthia in a torrent of light that outshone the galactic core itself, frequencies tuned not to destroy, but to mend, vibrations calibrated to the fundamental structure of space-time. The wound resisted. 1,000,000 years of erosion had widened it, weakened the barriers between dimensions, made the breach seem permanent and inevitable. But Kai Moro had spent his life fixing things that other people said were beyond repair. He pushed harder. The pain was indescribable. Energy flowing through a human nervous system that had never been designed for this. Consciousness stretched across light years until identity became a thin and fragile thread. But he held on with the same stubborn refusal to quit that Edris had. Identified as humanity's defining trait. The wound began to close, slowly at first, then faster. The edges of the dimensional breach drawing together under the resonance energy's relentless pressure. The hollow tide faltered. It thinned, weakened, began to pull back toward the closing wound like water draining through a shrinking hole. Across the galaxy, beings on 10,000 worlds watched their sensors in disbelief as the darkness retreated. The wound sealed with a sound that was not a sound, a resonance that every living being in the galaxy felt in their bones, a vibration that said the universe was whole again. The hollow tide did not die. It went home. Back through the sealed wound, back to the collapsed reality where it belonged, and the barrier between dimensions held firm behind it. Welded shut by a human mechanic with the biggest tool in existence. Silence fell across the galaxy. Then cheering, on warships and space, stations and planets and moons, in cities and villages and orbital habitats, from species that had never agreed on anything, erupting in a shared and primal joy that transcended every boundary that had ever divided them. On the bridge of the Adamanthea, Kai Moro opened his eyes. He was still himself. Changed, yes. His eyes carried a faint crystalline glow that would never fade, and his perception of the universe had shifted in ways he was still processing. And Edris had quietly informed him that his lifespan had been extended far beyond normal human limits. But he was still Kai. Still the man who thought in terms of problems and solutions, who preferred a wrench to a crown, who found more satisfaction in a well-repaired conduit than in all the glory the galaxy could offer. The Galactic Concord offered him everything: titles, territories, a seat on the High Council, command of the combined fleet, and 100 other honors that would have made him the most powerful individual in known space. He declined all of it. He asked for one thing. "I want a proper workshop on Deck 7, he told the stunned Chancellor. "Because half the relays down there are still held together with spit and prayer, and it is driving me absolutely crazy." The galaxy changed after that day. Humanity was no longer the short-lived tinkerers that the elder races tolerated and dismissed. They were the species that had produced the pilot who saved everything. The species whose chaotic and adaptable neurology had succeeded where 1,000,000 years of galactic civilization had failed. Human ingenuity, human stubbornness, and the simple human refusal to accept that something could not be fixed became the most respected traits in the galaxy. But Kai did not care much about legacy or reputation. 6 months after the hollow tide was sealed away, he sat in the Adamanthea's engine bay with his boots propped up on a console, manually rewiring a conduit that Idris had been nagging him about for weeks. Fen worked beside him, all 6 hands moving in perfect coordination, humming a Krill work song under their breath. Drea leaned in the doorway with a cup of something hot, smirking at both of them. The ship hummed around them, warm, alive, content. Idris spoke. "You know, the architects would have simply replaced that entire conduit." Kai grinned, sparks flying from his welding torch. "Yeah, well, I am not an architect. I am a mechanic." The Adamanthea hummed in agreement, the mightiest ship in the galaxy, held together by human hands.